sympathy, empathy, they're highly biased. And I think we become our best when we make decisions and we pull away from these biased emotions and we apply more fair and impartial methods.
Welcome to the On Wisdom podcast with Charles Cassidy and Igor Grossmann. Over the next hour, we'll be dissecting the latest research from the emerging field of wisdom science. We'll be discussing what it means for each of us and for society in terms of reasoning and living more wisely in the 21st century. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Please carry on rating us in iTunes. It's actually rather a sort of Kafka-esque process to work out how to actually get into iTunes and rate stuff. I was kind of looking at it today. It's kind of involved, so we do appreciate if you do that. Thanks very much. Today's episode 8, it's called The Dark Side. That will probably reveal itself as to why later. And when I think of the dark side, often I think of Paul Bloom. We have Paul Bloom with us today. So, Paul, would you welcome to the show? Thank you, firstly, for coming.
Thank you. That's a hell of an introduction.
Absolutely. Would you, rather than me sort of kind of getting it a little bit wrong, perhaps you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are and kind of what you're up to?
Sure. I'm Paul Bloom. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University, and I'm interested in a lot of things. My day job is as a developmental psychologist, so I do research on children. But one theme that carries through all my work is I'm very interested in morality and our sense of right and wrong. So I've written a book recently called Against Empathy, where I argue that empathy, though it has many strengths, is a poor moral guide. And recently I've become quite interested in cruelty. And so I've written a few pieces on exploring the nature of cruelty, why we're cruel to others, what motivates cruelty, and what we get out of it.
Yeah. So it's probably becoming clear why we titled the episode The Dark Side. That's kind of where we're at. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. And Igor, are you feeling trepidatious about approaching these sort of darker sides of humanity?
Oh, trepidatious. And I love it. This is the best. I mean, this is my Russian side is like right away. So I was like, oh, yes, negative stuff. Finally.
Yeah, I know Igor. He has a streak of cruelty in him.
Yeah,
very cruel, man.
Yeah, that makes sense. He was strongly suggesting we need to get Paul on, and I was thinking Paul, the compassionate guy. Yeah, let's get him on. Turns out there's a lot of levels to this. There's a few kind of questions just to kind of dive in. We're going to go into a lot of detail later, but I kind of wanted to start with this idea of when we're distressed, who do we turn to? So, Igor, I can't imagine you ever have a bad day, Igor. You're full of beans, always so, got that glint in your eye. But if you're having some sort of crisis, you can't get a good coffee. Right. Who do you go to? This is not an advert for coffee. I mean, like, who do you go to when you're distressed, and what do you want from them?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess for coffee, I would rather go to Google Maps, try to figure out where the next coffee shop is. But for difficulties, it depends. And I think we'll discuss this today. There's maybe a little bit of also cultural variability.
Right.
In some cultures, you ask people for advice. In other cultures, you ask people for emotional support, or you want them to listen to you instead of telling you what to do. And I guess in my case, it varies from day to day with language I speak, whom I am surrounded with.
Okay.
But yeah, if I have a bad day, I probably would ask somebody to listen to me, even though personally, when somebody comes to me, so I should listen, I often get into the position of giving them advice instead of actually just listening and shutting up.
I mean, it's quite an old idea, this classic stereotype of men wanting to fix things and women wanting someone to listen to them. Paul, from your experience, do you find does that bear out in the kind of the data? Is there any sort of gender split on this? That men sort of try to be a bit more sort of distant and action oriented, and women tend to be more looking for that emotional support?
I don't have the foggiest idea what the data have to say. I will say that I live out that stereotype in my everyday life.
Right. There's the data.
I'm very happy. But I'm very happy to give advice and to help people when they come to me. But for the longest time, I would sort of instinctively say, look, here are the options in your situation, and here's what you should do, and and it took me many years to realize that in some contexts, this is not what people want.
Mm.
Right.
And largely, part of realization is it's often not what I want. If my answer to your question, sadly, about who do I go to when I'm in some sort of anguish or trouble, is often nobody. But I've been trying to do better, and I have family, I have friends, and then I'll talk to them. And I often don't want concrete suggestions. I want a sympathetic ear. I want somebody to care about me. I want somebody to understand me.
It was good. So Paul sent over some papers and various bits and pieces and articles, and there was this idea about when there's an audience, sometimes it drives us to behave in more moral ways. So, the reason I wanted to kind of just dive in with this question, and what you think about this, Igor and Paul, is that I was speaking to a friend recently. This sounds like I was speaking to a friend, but it was actually a friend of mine, not me, who was saying he was in the situation when someone else said something racist, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know whether he should call the person out on being, it's this sort of subtle thing, he could have just let it go. And that kind of got me thinking about the motivations as what motivates us. Or firstly, what would we do in that situation? Do you call someone out? And secondly, what's going on? What are what's really driving if we do decide to intervene? Is it because we want to be seen to be good? Is it because we think we're genuinely going to educate this person? So what are your thoughts? Say, Igor, what do imagine that scenario. What would you do? And what might, if you could be analytical about it, what might be driving it?
That's really interesting. I mean, I didn't have the experience with racism as you describe it, but what I had experience with were a few episodes where something where the behavior didn't seem quite right to me or out of the norm happened. And if it happened the first time, here's what's interesting. If it happens the first time, I often really didn't know what to do. But then a few times I just had a discussion about something similar with my wife. And then I happen to be on the plane and I see somebody trying to change their seat from a very bad seat somewhere at the very back of the plane where they're stuck in between somebody to somewhere in the front. And I'm just thinking, why would that person ask somebody who has a perfectly fine seat to switch with them? And are there... So I asked that person. I mean, I was not really reprimanding them or anything. I just wanted to know what are the reasons. And it turned out he had a good reason because he had a brother nearby and he wanted to be close to his brother, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, so there are often, I sense if you have some kind of a knowledge or some kind of a strategy or goal, maybe that would help you to call somebody out. But I'm often shy to do that in public. I mean, I think it's a different thing if it's online.
Well, this is actually one thing we do have psychological data on, which is our intuitions about what we would do are very different from what we actually do. My colleague, Marianne LaFrance, once asked a bunch of women, this studied on a long time ago, how they would respond if someone asked inappropriate questions during a job interview. And almost without exception, women said they would protest, they would walk out and so on. And then she actually did a simulation where it was sort of a fake job interview. And none of the women did that. They all just sat there. Rosanna Summers just graduated from Yale Law School. I did some psychological work here. And if you ask people, suppose I ask you guys, suppose you walk into an experiment and the experimenter asks you right away, could you hand over your cell phone and give me the passcode, please? Most people would say there's no way I would do that. And yet most people do it. And this is actually a particular case. So it's very easy for me to say, oh, I would protest a racist comment. I would speak out. The truth is, it's not actual sort of fear. It's not physical cowardice that stops us most of the time. We just don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want the awkwardness. It's much easier to do nothing. And so I would say that the honest truth in most of my life when I've seen people act inappropriately, with some notable exceptions, but for most of the time, like everybody else, I do nothing.
It just occurred to me when you were saying that people would report that they would do something. In effect, that's actually kind of an event in itself. When someone says, what would you do? There's a motive. There's a motive there. When you report what you would claim to do, that's still a chance to show your morality in a way. So even though that sounds like a sort of a shadow event, that's an event in itself, isn't it, in a way?
Yes. And we want to present ourselves in certain ways. And I think we want to believe of ourselves. I've always been skeptical about the notion of self-signaling, but I think there's something to the idea that when we answer a question like that, we listen to ourselves speak and we're pleased that we're that kind of person.
Yeah. But then the barrier to actually act on that is really quite significant, isn't it? The sort of social awkwardness with making a scene, especially if you're British, we're very good at avoiding that sort of
thing. I'm Canadian, so, it's just as bad.
Got a little bit
and Igor's right, which is on the internet, all bets are off.
Right.
On the internet, people are much more liberated to call out people. And you could see that having a good side. I think for most of our lives, we encountered the bad side of that, where people are like, screaming obscenities to us who would never do this sort of thing in real life, but they're become uninhibited over Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah, because there's no cost, I suppose, in that scenario.
That's right.
This reminds me, I just had a conversation last week with somebody in Germany. You guys may remember that a few years ago during the Christmas market in Berlin, they had a truck that went through with some madman, killing a lot of